Right, so today we're going to be looking at mastering visual communication. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what on earth do I mean by visual communication? But what we're going to be looking at is how we communicate with things like diagrams and graphs and other kind of visuals that we create. So this is in addition to the tables of data you might have and the text and things like that. So I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Jackie Reed. I wrote the book Communication Patterns, which if you check out the book's website, you can find out where to get it. If you've got an O'Reilly subscription, you can read it online as part of that. So go and have a look. And I do teach a bit on O'Reilly as well. In fact, I teach a course on this, which is 2 hours long. So if you're part of that, then come and have a look at that. So I work as a principal consultant, so I go into companies and I consult on things like software architecture, enterprise architecture, knowledge management, and things like that. And the aim is to help companies to actually own their architecture rather than it kind of owning them, which is the case in most companies. So today we're going to be looking at what is actual effective visual communication, because we can all scribble a load of boxes and lines, but how do we really communicate what we want to communicate? And the way I've done this in the book and in this presentation is by patterns and anti-patterns, because sort of developers and architects, we understand those. And so that's how I've set them out. And you'll be able to see them. We've got ticks for our patterns, we've got crosses for our anti-patterns, so it's nice and easy to see. And what we're going to be doing is trying to avoid those pitfalls, those anti-patterns, and deliver the impact that we want with our diagrams, because it's very important that we communicate exactly what we mean. Now, I'm going to start off by saying that the style of your diagrams actually communicates something as well. Now, if you look at these two, there's only a small difference. But which one of these would you say is the more developed idea? I want you to put your hands up. Do you think number one's the more developed idea? Or number two? Yeah, definitely looking at number two. So they're exactly the same diagram, but it's communicating something to you. And what we need to do is we need to actually use that style to help us communicate to the audience. Now, if you were showing a diagram in this kind of style at the beginning of a project, your project manager or product owner might say, oh, great, when does testing start? And this might just be a sort of idea. They've got the wrong idea from what your diagram looks like. But if you'd shown them that, they might not have got that wrong idea. But imagine showing this kind of style diagram very late in a project. You might get stakeholders going, oh, are things not as far along as we thought? So it's just that underlying message, and I call this pattern meta style, just like metadata, because it's kind of that underlying subconscious idea. And so this is using style to communicate. And what we're trying to do here is we're using style to our advantage rather than actually miscommunicating stuff to people. And so if you can just bear that in mind, it makes it a lot easier when you're communicating. Right, another question for you. I've got two data flow diagrams here. They're quite low level, quite sort of down in the information. Would you use style 1 or style 2? So hands up if you would use number 1. And hands up if you use number 2. Again, that's mostly number 2. My answer to that is going to be it depends, because it's software architecture. So you would probably most likely use number 2 here. But what if this is just an idea and you're kind of just getting down to it? Maybe you don't want to use number 1. Or maybe your company says, this is how we draw diagrams. Then you're probably going to be going with number 1 as well. Right, another pattern now. This one I call face in the crowd, also known as know your audience. And this is something that we kind of all know this. We kind of all know different audiences need different types of diagram, different details, things like that. but it's something that we quite often forget when we actually get into doing the diagrams. So we need to be thinking about who the diagram is for, not just going, oh, I've been told to create this diagram. And if you have been asked to create a specific diagram, you then need to think or ask, who is this diagram going to be for? Because that will determine what you're going to put in it. So there's a few questions that you need to ask yourself. The first is, what's their technical understanding? Maybe you've got a very technical project manager, maybe a very non-technical project manager. If you're creating something for your product owner, do they want to know all the details of the technology you have chosen, or do they just need to know how that technology meets the requirements of their product? So we're thinking about that. And we're also looking at what level of detail they need, whether it's technical or not. Maybe you're presenting to a architecture review board, and you need to think, does this board want a lot of detail? I've seen boards that want to see all the detail, and then I've seen other boards who want to just see the high-level stuff because you should have worked out all the detail with other people beforehand. So they just want to see that high-level summary. Then one of the really important ones is, what do they actually want from you? And to successfully communicate, you need to have met their needs with this diagram. But the big one that people really forget is, what do you want from them? Do you need them to sign off on a decision based on this diagram or presentation you're showing them? Do you need them to actually make a decision? And if they don't have the information they need to do what you need them to do, then your communication has failed. Slightly chicken and egg, because they probably don't know what they need. You've got to work out what they need. So you don't just get to sit there. Who's this diagram for? It's a class diagram, a UML diagram. Just shout it out. Developers? Anyone else? Pardon? No one. That's really good. Yes, no one. Yes, this is going to be for either no one, or because they don't want it, or it's going to be for developers, maybe people who are administering your database, that kind of thing. Now, what about this one? This is a C4 context diagram. So this is very high level. Who's this for? CTO? Good one. Product owner? Basically, this is pretty much for everyone. I would say this is even for developers, because even if you're working down in the code, you should be understanding the context of the system. So there we go. And now we're going to look at another anti-pattern. This one I call multi-story diagram, or mixing levels of abstraction. And this one's quite an interesting one. So mixing levels of abstraction is kind of a sin in coding, and you've probably come across this. We have these different kinds of levels of abstraction, and they're different in different code bases, but we split things out into these different abstraction levels in code. We also do this in architecture. I mentioned C4, it's the C4 model earlier. If you haven't had a look at that, I can recommend it. But this splits it out into different levels of abstraction. And we looked at that context one before. We also, in some of our frameworks that we use, have these different levels of abstraction. So the SABSA framework is a security framework, and this splits it out into these different levels as well. Now, if we have a diagram that doesn't split these levels out, we get some confusion. Because if you look at, there we go, if you look at this software system here, that is on a different level of abstraction to all of the arrows that are coming out of it. And so it's just a little bit confusing as to what this really means. And so what we do is we split it out into these different levels. So we have this context level. This is the same as we looked at earlier. And then the next level down is a container diagram. Now, if you see this dotted line around here, this is that dark blue system from the other diagram. And so this has split that information out, and we can see how these things really connect to each other. We can see that this external media API is being connected to by that interface. And so if we mix those levels of abstraction, we're going to cause confusion. So basically, don't, just like in your code. Now, this is quite often people's favorite anti-pattern. I call this an explosion of unicorns, and I just need to do something quickly before I carry on. So, you may have seen some diagrams a bit like this. I would wear these just like for a health and safety thing, like X-rays, because I see this so often. So we've got a different color for every different service because everything does a different thing. It's all quite bright. It's really overwhelming. But it's not just the fact that it's bright. It's the fact that the color doesn't actually mean anything. It's just saying these are all different things. And I can see they're different things. They're separate boxes. This is fine. And you may as well be showing people stuff like this. Now you can understand why I've got these up. By the way, don't ever do a search for a rainbow unicorn GIF on the internet. This is one of the best. There's some awful things out there. You've been warned. I take no responsibility if you choose to now do that. So, I can take these off now. I've sorted that out. Now, I'm not saying you can't use bright colors. I'm not going to rain on your parade there. So there's still a couple of reasonably bright colors here. But I've reduced it down. I've taken those colors back again. And I've actually used the colors for meaning. So you can use type or function. There's even a key here. And this just is using the color to actually communicate something. Now, if you use color without having any meaning, people will try and read meaning into it because our brains are constantly looking for patterns. So if we minimize that color palette, it means that people have got less to keep in their heads. They can concentrate better. They can understand things better. And we're going to use that color to aid communication. So another anti-pattern we've got here, I call this spider's web, or unclear relationships. Now, apologies if anyone doesn't like spiders. There's only one. It's fine. But you may have seen a diagram a bit like this, where, I bet you've all seen these, where it's just kind of all over the place. And your little spider there would be quite happy sitting there in your diagram. And when you look at these, a lot of it, you're not sure which label goes with which line. It's very confusing. So there's a few things we can do here. The first one is to actually just remove anything that's unnecessary. So you'll probably find that a lot of diagrams have stuff in there that's not relevant to the message they're trying to communicate. It's just, oh, there's a piece of information, we'll just put it in there anyway. So you can take stuff out completely. You can split that diagram up, like I was saying before, into different levels of abstraction. You can also split it out, so maybe you're finding that your logging or your security is making your diagram a big mess, in which case, pull it out into a separate diagram. If everything's connecting to one little logging service or something, then make a new diagram with that logging service in the middle and just what it connects to. And don't worry about what everything else around connects to as well. It's just, this is what the logging does. Then we need to minimize those line crossings as much as we can. And if you just move things around, you'll probably find out that you can minimize them. Where there are line crossings, you need to use a nice big jump, a sort of C shape. And a lot of programs, the default is very small, so I recommend making it a bit bigger. Then we want to standardize the position of that label on the arrow. It's so much easier if you put, say, them all at the beginning of the arrow. When you're then just looking over that diagram, it's so much easier to go, okay, that label goes with that arrow, that label goes with that arrow. There will be exceptions. I'll show you an example in a minute. And then if we use angled lines, which are called orthogonal normally, they're a lot easier to manipulate and use. And I'll show you this. So on the left here, we've got the sort of rearranged version with the orthogonal right angle lines. And then the right, that's the old one. And so if we have a look at this, I've used all those lines. I've actually managed to not need to use any line jumps at all in this case. But if you look at these two up here, they're not at the beginning of the line, but there's a reason for that. The one that's going up to the customer database, I've moved that up to make it clearer as to where it is. And of course, with this one, because of the line being like that, it's much more sensible to put it there. But other than that, they're all fairly close to the beginning of the line. So that's just making it an awful lot easier for people to understand. So my big thing is, I'll come to questions at the end if that's all right. My big thing is that diagrams are free. And Neil Ford likes to say this about slides, about not packing too much into each slide. You shouldn't be packing too much into your diagrams as well. Splitting them up makes it much easier for people to understand them. And I'm going to talk about how you help people navigate between your different diagrams a bit later on. Now, another colour one here. You're going to have to help me again with this one. You don't just get to sit there in my talks. Now, which one of these is the yellow one? I've simulated Protanopia, and I'm going to get you to vote now on which one of these you actually think is the yellow one. And it's made a little bit harder for you by the fact that this screen is slightly tinted yellow as well. So, who thinks A is the yellow one? B? C? D? Okay, pretty much everyone got that one right. But what about this one? Now I've simulated tritanopia, which is another form of colour blindness, and I've moved them round. It's not going to be the same one. Sorry. So who thinks it's E? A few people there. F? G? And H. And that one was much more split between all the different ones. Now it is actually E in this case, and I'll show you them next to each other now. But this just kind of goes to show that it's not just, oh, don't use red and green in your diagrams, because other colours look different to people with different types of colour blindness. And there's actually a lot of different types of colour blindness. And some people can see a colour partially, some people can't see a colour at all. And then very rarely there are people who actually can't see any colour at all. So, approximately 4.5% of the world's population is colourblind. And you might think, oh, okay, that's not that many people. I don't need to worry about this too much. But that's kind of what accessibility is about. We don't think, oh, there's not that many people in wheelchairs, so we won't bother with ramps, do we? So, it's actually 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women, and that's to do with XY chromosomes, which I'm not any kind of expert on that, so I won't go into it. But if you think about it, in this room and in the tech industry in general, are there more men or more women? There's a lot more men. So you're a lot more likely to come across someone who's colourblind in the tech industry, at least at the moment. Hopefully that will change. And it's actually more than 350 million people worldwide, which is more than the total population of the USA and about half the population of Europe. So it's a lot of people, and if you think of it like that, rather than 4.5%, it makes a big difference, I think. Now, there's a few things we can do with this. If you do web development, then there are some tools that you can install, or in fact, I think Chrome and Firefox at least actually have this in their development tools where you can simulate different types of colour blindness when you're looking at your user interface. And so you can have a look at it and see whether there's anything that's problematic there. If you've got some instructions that say, look at the red box or something like that, then that's probably going to cause some problems with people. So here's a quick demonstration of a palette that I'd made. I just pulled it out of a picture I liked, just picked some colours, and then I did a simulation. And so that's the palette, that's the standard one. And if you have a look at this, there's actually quite a few where the colour looks basically the same with these two different blues. And there's a couple of things you can do with that. The simplest thing is to just not use one of them. Ta-da! But maybe you need 5 colours. You can either substitute that colour or you can change the luminosity of the colour so that it looks more different. But obviously, you've then got to recheck it again. So we can use that colourblind simulator, but maybe we don't have time to do that. First tip, if you don't have much time, look at it in grayscale, because if you can't tell the difference in grayscale, then there's going to be an issue somewhere. So that's the big thing. But when we're using things like Draw.io or Visio or anything, and we use the standard colour palettes, we might think, oh, this is all right. These must be checked. These must be safe. Nope. So these are a couple of colours from standard Draw.io. If we have a look at them and simulate Deuteranopia, they're basically the same colour. You can't tell the difference between them. There is no point in using those two colours. If we take some colours from my colour deficiency friendly one and we simulate it, you can see the colours are different to standard. There's nothing you can do about that. But they do look different from each other. And so we can see that this top scheme is not colourblind friendly, whereas the bottom one is. So do not trust that your software or even your corporate colour scheme, which everyone tells you to use, is actually colourblind friendly, because someone has to have thought about this. So the big thing here is don't rely on colour alone. I'm not expecting you to go and spend hours trying to create a palette. You can do some other different things. Now, I talked about grayscale. Those were 2 colours before, but now I've turned it into grayscale. They are exactly the same thing. But what about if we add a pattern? Now, that would look fine whether it was on the colour or on the grayscale, and all you have to do is make sure there's enough contrast between your pattern and the background colour for people to be able to see it. But there we go. We didn't even need to change our colours. We just added a pattern. How about symbols? Throughout this, I've been using the ticks and the crosses. I could have used colours like red and green, and I very often see people who are presenting, and if they're showing something that's not good, they'll put a red line around the outside, and they'll put a green line around the outside. And you think, a lot of people can't tell the difference between that, so there's no point in doing it. If you did that and put a tick or a cross as well, you're sorted. You can use them together. So a few do's here. These are nice and easy ones. So use the patterns, the symbols. You can use labels as well. That's another simple one. You can also use the different saturation levels, as I said, with the colours. Checking it in grayscale will show you if you need to change that saturation level. We've then got the colour deficiency simulation tools. There are lots of them out there that are free. There's some web-based ones and ones that you can install. I like to use one called SimDaltonism on my Mac, but it's only for Mac. But I love that because it has a sort of window, and you can just drag it on top of the stuff that you're looking at. It's really nice. Then we need to consider monitor and prediction calibration. So you might see this is supposed to be white. Is it white? No, it's a kind of yellowy colour. And you're probably quite lucky in that case, because on some of the other screens here, this would have been really bright. So consider that. And then also, is your diagram going to be shown in grayscale? Now, it doesn't affect a lot of people now, but when I was creating my book, the printed copy is in grayscale. And so all the diagrams that I created had to, at the very least, print well and be distinguishable in grayscale. There's also a few of them that you have to show in color, and so there has to be a URL so that people can see it online as well. So there's lots of considerations when you're thinking about them. Right, another pattern here. This one is another one of those ones like audience where people think, oh yeah, obvious, but it gets forgotten all the time. So, written in legend, also known as use a key or legend. Whichever you prefer, I don't mind. It's the same thing. We'll call it what you want. But what we need to do is not rely on our audience having any specific knowledge. Now, one of the big things that I really see with this is people using icons for stuff like AWS in particular, and all these different things. And they just use the icon, and maybe they name it. They're like, oh, here's the icon, my service. And I'm looking at that going, I don't really want my knowledge of AWS icons tested today. Like, what is that? And also, quite often, there are very similar versions of an icon as well, which mean different things. So do not rely on people knowing what icons are. Now, this is going to be a bit of a balancing act, because you're going to find that your diagrams aren't just for one person or one audience, at least most of the time. You're probably going to find that they're actually for business and technical, or at least for people who have different amounts of knowledge. Maybe you've got architects and senior developers, but maybe you've got some junior developers as well. And so we're going to kind of think about balancing this. Now, if you look at this photo, we've got a ramp coming up there, but we've also got some steps. And so what we're doing here is that we're saying, right, anyone who needs or wants to use the ramp can do that. But if you can get somewhere quicker by coming up these steps, feel free. And that's the kind of thing we want to do with our diagrams. Now, this diagram is a domain story. And if you haven't heard of domain storytelling, I can recommend having a look at it. It's a really interesting way of working collaboratively with stakeholders to get information out. And it's kind of on the similar kind of collaboration level as event storming, if you've ever done that. But it's quite different. And so you create these diagrams from icons, and we sort of number the process there. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And you look at this, you're like, oh, I chose these icons. It's really obvious what they mean. But don't assume other people think of it in the same way as you. Other people might think that these things mean different things. We can also say that, look, the numbers mean order of sequence, which, yeah, that's obvious, isn't it? It must be the order of sequence, but someone might think it means something else, like priority, or who knows what they might mean. So what we're trying to do here is not leave our diagrams open to any interpretation. This is not kind of some kind of art gallery or interpretive dance or anything like that. We want people to get that message, not just appreciate it for its beauty. No, not going to work, is it? So UML, some people think that everyone knows what UML means, but no, they really don't. But now, oh no, we've kind of cluttered this up a bit. What can we do to make it so that it's easier for people to read? The first thing you can do is only include the bit that you need, which in this case would be that specialization bit. Another thing you can also do is if you're putting this in a web page or something like that, you can have a link which will either maybe like just open up and show that key or open a new tab or whatever. But you're doing this ramps and steps thing. You're trying to not annoy people and clutter things up, but also give everyone the information they need to understand your diagram. C4, these are really easy to read. These are for everyone. I've already told you that. But actually, Simon Brown, who invented these, said always include a key. And I think this is really, really important, because even if you're thinking, oh, it's really obvious, the grey ones are the external stuff. It's just obvious, isn't it? It's not to everybody. If people have never seen C4 before, if people are non-technical, if people are new into the industry, even if people have been in the industry a long time, things aren't as obvious as they seem. So what we're doing is we're limiting our assumptions, and this is what we try and do in software architecture and design all the time. When we create our designs for our architecture, we're writing down our assumptions. We're going to the stakeholders and we're saying, this is what I'm assuming. Is that correct or not? What's really happening here? And so we need to limit our assumptions when we're creating our designs and our architectures, but we also need to do that when we're creating our diagrams as well. Don't assume people have knowledge or understand what's in your head, because that's in your head, not theirs. Right. Another anti-pattern. This one's another one that you're going to have to help me with as well. Sorry, you thought you were going to have a rest. So this one is multiple letter acronym hell. The big message here is only use defined acronyms. Now, when you're speaking, the best way to do this is to actually use both when you're speaking. So I've been using AKA. So if I was speaking, I would say AKA, also known as. And that means that people get the chance to actually learn what it means. If you only ever use the full version because you think people won't understand the acronym, then they never get to learn that. And so when other people use the acronym, they won't understand it. So use both of them when you're speaking, especially if you know that the audience won't understand it. When you're writing things, it depends on how long what you're writing is. But if it's quite short, just define it at the beginning, and then you can carry on using it. If you're writing something really long, maybe you're writing a white paper or some kind of report, if it's really long, or if you're using it throughout your wiki and your documentation, you might want to define it more often, maybe at the top of each section, that kind of thing. Then if you're using it in a diagram, if you're using them to save space in your diagram because you can't fit the full thing in, put it in the key. That's another good use of your key. And then, of course, there's glossaries as well. If you're using documentation, you can put everything in a glossary, and that means everyone's on the same page. Now, it's your turn. What does DRY stand for? A bit louder. Don't repeat yourself. And you all just did, so never mind. So, that one is don't repeat yourself. What about DFD? Data flow diagram, yes. There was a hint earlier, I used them. SPA? Single page application, well done. BLT? Bacon, lettuce, and tomato. Exactly. Or is it business leadership team? Basic language translator? Bulk loading tool? Or is it just be like that? So you get my point. It can mean different things to different people. And I think this is something that a lot of people forget, that even if people are very similar to you, an acronym can mean something completely different. I realized recently that knowing an acronym can be the difference between whether you watch Netflix or not, because that acronym's used a lot on there or not. So even if you think someone is just like you could be thinking completely different things. And a lot of people could be getting very hungry when someone's talking about a business leadership team. And we don't really want that. So it's easy to fall into thinking that other people have this same understanding as you. And everybody does this because you understand things in your brain. Well, okay, most of the time you understand things in your brain. But other people, even if they're very similar to you, think of things really differently. And so next time you use an acronym, I want you to think SIDI, which is state it and define it. And yes, I'm being silly. I'm not trying to invent another acronym, but I just did do exactly that. stated it, and defined it. Right, now we have another pattern. This one I call push in the right direction, or also known as match the diagram flow to expectations. Now this is an interesting one because lots of diagrams have a flow of information, pretty much all, even if that's not what you're communicating. There is some kind of flow in your diagram. If we look at this one, we look at that and you think nobody actually thought about who was going to read this diagram and how they were going to read it, despite the fact it doesn't fit nicely on a slide. And if you consider it, how many of your diagrams are ever shown on an A4 piece of paper now? They're all shown on a screen, aren't they? Pretty much all your diagrams are going to be looked at by someone with a 16:9, 16:10, that kind of ratio. Maybe a 4:3, but it's not very likely these days. And in this diagram, the actual start of the diagram is in the bottom right. But in English, we would expect that to start on the top left, or at least the left. And so if we rearrange this diagram, this is exactly the same diagram. First of all, it fits nicely on the screen, which is another thing to think about. But if you look here, oh, wrong button. If you look on the left here, this customer, that's the start of the diagram. And then things go from left to right to request, and from right to left to get the data back out again. And so we're matching that English left to right, and then we have that nice, easy way to see, oh, this one's a request, this one's coming back out, this one's a request, this one's the reply. And that, again, you're lifting that load off your audience. You're giving them something that's really obvious. Now, a talk I went to yesterday was talking about how we've learned an awful lot from plane disasters. And one of those things that they've learned was don't change things between aeroplanes when there isn't a safety thing for it. So one disaster was caused because a switch was the opposite way round in the simulator compared to in the plane. Now, how ridiculous is that? But so easy to do in critical systems as well as non-critical systems. So we are making sure that our audience doesn't have to think too much, because we want them to understand the information, not try and decode it. Now, when it comes to diagrams such as this one, this is much easier to get that flow correct. Now, if you have a look here, we've got the flow starting here, and it goes nicely from left to right and left to right. And to do that, all I had to do was get these items at the top in the right order. So once you've done that, then you get this nice flow in your diagram. So sequence diagrams are a lot easier to get this right in. So when we're putting our diagram together, we're going to consider how our audience is going to read it, not just how do I fit all this information into the diagram. Splodge, 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 that will do. Splodge is a technical term, by the way. Right, another pattern here. I call this one show them the pirate ship, also known as enthrall your audience with context. And this is actually named after one of the chapters in Gregor Hopé's book, The Software Architect Elevator, which I can recommend. And he talks about this in similar terms. And he talks about this with Lego, or Legos as he calls them. So he says, when you look at the cover of a box of Legos, you don't see a picture of each individual brick that's inside. Instead, you see the picture of an exciting, fully assembled model positioned in a lifelike pirate's bay with cliffs and sharks. And some people say to me, yes, but I'm not creating diagrams for children. Now, some of you may be thinking you actually are. It depends who you're working with. But the whole point here is that we're thinking about the context. So this might be what we want to talk about in our meeting. This is the information we want to be looking at. This is what we're reviewing. But this is a level 2 data flow diagram. So we're not going to be starting down here. This is the little bits of Lego. This is like looking at the back of the box. What we want to do is we want to start at the top level of our data flow diagram. And we're going to look at this first to give people that context and then move into that lower level. So we've got the top level and then the next level. But actually, what you probably really need to do is start even earlier in the story than that. We need to give people some context to what we're talking about. So we can start off with either boxes and lines. It doesn't have to be C4, but some kind of high-level diagram. Then, if we need to, we can go through the next level and the next level. And so what we've done here is we've created this narrative. Now, depending on your audience, will mean how much time you spend in each of these. If people are very new to it, you're going to be spending more time in each of these levels. If people aren't particularly new, then you can just go through these fairly quickly. But even if you just go, okay, so here, we're looking at this bit here, and that links to here. Even if you just do that, you're reminding people of where you are, and you're probably going to get less questions, more understanding. So this is creating a narrative. And what you can do is you can take your diagrams and other artifacts that you have, and you can line them up and see if they create a narrative. And if you see that there are gaps, maybe you're missing one of those diagrams that really links the others together, then you can put that in. And so if you actually do that exercise, it can really benefit you. Because if you fall into that gap in the middle of a presentation, that's not quite so good. Right, this one is another anti-pattern. This one is called Not So Unified Modeling Language. Now, I've already found at least one person who doesn't like UML from earlier. And this is basically using UML when it's not useful. And there are companies out there who say all of our diagrams must be UML. And UML can be useful, but those points are actually dwindling now. Now, UML is actually split into two different types, structural and behavioral. Now, you might be thinking, I didn't know there were this many types of UML diagram, but only a few of them, these ones, tend to actually be used. Now, what we're thinking about here, going back to what I was talking about earlier, is what does your audience actually need? Do they need a UML component diagram? I can tell you that I've made precisely one UML component diagram in my developer and architect career, and that's this one. And it was really fiddly to do because tools aren't made for doing all these tiny little lines and the different types of arrows. So what we need to do is keep it simple and straightforward and think about what we're trying to communicate and to who. This diagram shows you basically the same information. But everybody can understand that. You put a key in, even better, as I was talking about earlier. UML sequence diagrams encourage you to go into like the nitty-gritty little bits, like what methods are we calling? But how quickly is that going to go out of date? Some people are pushing to production constantly throughout the day. There's no point in having that kind of diagram. But if we have a more high-level sequence diagram, then this is not going to go out of date as quickly. And we can think about what level do we really need to look at, thinking about those levels of abstraction. The more you go down in those levels, the more likely your diagram is going to change. So think about whether you really need them. So if you're using UML, you need to use UML for good reason. And if you can't say why you're using it, and if you think that your audience is not going to be able to understand it, then consider using something else instead. Now, how many more of these have I got? Yeah, we've got time. So this one I call structures behaving badly. And what I was saying about the fact that we have structural and behavioral, and there is some logic to this with the way UML splits these up. Because if we put structure and behavior in the same diagram, it can be quite confusing. Sometimes it's all right if it's very simple, but in general, it's best to pull them out. So if we have a diagram like this one, and thinking of color, on my monitor, this looks blue. So if we have this mixture, there's more information in there, and so it's more to actually take in the first place. But if we split it out into more than one diagram, this was just a boxes and lines diagram, this one now much more simply communicates the structure. And then we can use things like flow diagrams, data flow diagrams, to communicate the behavior from that diagram. So you know the single responsibility principle for your code. We're going to apply that to our diagrams as well. And it's amazing how many of these principles that for code and architecture that can be applied in all these different domains as well. Now, this is going to be our last one for today, and I said that I was going to talk about connecting up our different diagrams. So this is called representational consistency, and this is showing that connection between the diagrams and allowing people to navigate easily between them. Now, I showed you this earlier, but that dark blue box on the context diagram becomes that dotted box on the next level down. And so whichever one of these diagrams you see first, you can connect it to the other one. When we're looking at the data flow diagrams, you might have noticed this earlier, we've got these numbers. Now, if you look in the first diagram, we've got a number 2, in the second diagram, 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. Nice and easy to connect that. But there's also our data stores. We've got A and B in both diagrams. Make sure you use the same labels in each diagram, but that will then give you that connection between them. Right. Ooh, falling over. So what we're going to do is we're going to make explicit references to these other levels of abstraction. Now, I said at the beginning that this was taken from my book. These are a very small number of the ones that are from part 1 in the book. You can also find communication patterns in there on things like written communication, communication of knowledge, and if you're working in distributed teams and remote teams as well. So if you take a look at the website, there's also a couple of freebies on there because it talks about things like architecture decision records. So there are some free templates and examples that you can use on there as well. Now, also, at the end, anyone who would like to, I will have some bookmarks, and they have got a code on them, so you can get 30 days free on O'Reilly. So come and see me at the end if you would like one of those. I will put some out on the table. So thank you very much. Feel free to contact me and come and talk to me afterwards. We have got a couple of minutes, so if there are any questions, we can have a quick go through those, but if not, I will make myself available afterwards. So thank you very much. We had one question there. Let's go for that one. So is that why are the diagrams only unidirectional? Why are the arrows only one
I
direction?
was wondering if you had any thoughts on having them being bidirectional.
Yeah. So if you have an arrow that's bidirectional, you're probably actually going to find it's really difficult to label that arrow because it's probably different things happening in each direction. And so what you're probably better off doing is having two unidirectional arrows that show different things. You might find also that in one direction it's synchronous and in the other direction it's asynchronous. And typically synchronous, we use a solid line, and asynchronous is a dotted line, just as a kind of convention. But yeah, if you have an arrow that's bidirectional going both ways, it's probably just not split up enough, and it can be a bit confusing. There's going to be exceptions, but they're going to be rare.
But if it came to the instance where that will clutter your diagram too much, would you just split that up into another diagram?
So the question was, if that cluttered your diagram too much to have more arrows, would you split that up? And there's a few things you need to think about. There's, yes, you can split things out, and sometimes it might be that you don't actually need that information in the diagram in the first place. So it's a question of, do I need the information? Another technique which is in the book is about pulling information out of the diagram into annotations and notes. So you can use annotations actually in the diagram, or you can put notes at the top. And I recommend keeping them in the diagram, because if you put the notes as text next to it, they tend to get separated and lost. But you can just put a number 1 and then put 1 and note down what it is. So that declutters.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's good. Right, if anyone else wants to ask anything else, I will make myself available over here, but I know we've got another person coming in. So thank you.